Good morning, everybody. Or it's kind of almost afternoon. I already got to do one round, so I'm back for my second round now. Now I'm actually awake and everything, so it might actually be useful to you. This is what happens when you're 62. People clap just because you're awake. So hey, if I make any weird sounds, moaning or groaning sounds, it's because I'm 62 and I actually hurt myself sleeping. I injured myself sleeping, and so every now and then I make this sound of my father, and if I do, just ignore it. If you're one of those people that are distracted or really, oh, poor guy, it's okay. It's going to be okay. So I'm Chuck Gerwig, and I am so pleased to be here with you guys and awake again this morning. As you might know, you may or may not know me, I've been here a few times. My wife and I have moved back down to Ventura County, Newbury Park, and grew up in this area. And I've been able to come and guest teach in between pastors and other guys on their vacations and things. And it's been really fun. Andrew and I love your church. God is doing great things here. And like every church, you guys have been through COVID plus, which is just a wild ride. But I get to go to lots of churches. And I really love what God is doing here. If you're newer and you're figuring out if this is your church or not, I don't know. But if it is, you'll be blessed. It's a great place to be. So I work for a company an organization called Global Training Network, and I have this unique job where I get to go to different places in primarily Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, and help train pastors who do not have the resources to get any kind of formal training. So there are people either getting ready to be a pastor of a church, or they may be pastoring a church of hundreds of people and have had no training in how do you lead an organization, how do you disciple people, how do you do evangelism, no training in basic theology or Bible knowledge. They're just doing the best they can because they're called. And it is so stinking fun. You can't even imagine it. To go in a room with a whole bunch of people, men and women, and who are saying, hey, we need to know how to preach a sermon. And I go, oh, I like to talk about this. So I get to go do that. It's really rewarding. It's a super blessing. And as a result, you get to see what God's doing all over the world. And He is alive and at work in ways that you cannot imagine if you're a Westerner. Because things here just feel a little dry, a little down-rampy in America in general. But God is at work. I'm glad to be part of it. And I'm super stoked to be able to be here and say stoked and have somebody know what I'm talking about. So I grew up in Thousand Oaks. I grew up surfing at C Street, and I was one of those guys who was Valley guy. And so my native communication is Southern Californian, and so it's so great to share God's word with you. And I've got good news for you this morning, because the Bible is great news. I want to encourage you to think this morning about how God feels. How does it feel to be God, and how does He feel when He thinks about you and when He thinks about others in the world, people who do a lot of wrong, people who do less wrong, people who do a little better? How does God feel? Because we recognize that Jesus came to save us and to reveal not only who God is, but what He's like. Because He's so other and you can't see Him. And He very rarely speaks out loud. So how do you know what God's like? And God is person. God is person. That means He has intellect. He has will and can choose to do or not do things. And He has emotion. The Bible shows God as being a person of emotion. And when Jesus came to the earth, He came to show us and reveal more about what God is like. And how does He feel even? You know, if you read the Bible and you see, write these down in your notes if you like, Colossians 1 verse 15 says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. What is God like? We look at Jesus. He makes the invisible visible. So we read the Gospels. As we read the rest of the New Testament, He shows us what is God like, including how does God feel. If you go to Hebrews 1 verse 3, it says Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. You want to know what the Father is like and how He feels? Well, we look at how does Jesus respond? What does he think and how does he feel in different situations? And then Hebrews 13:8 tells us this. Jesus is the same. Say it with me if you know it. Yesterday. Right. And we're kind of in the tomorrow phase. Jesus is the same. He's come to reveal the exact, what you can know about God, including his feelings. We live in a world where so much crazy stuff happens, and because of technology, we can see it, we can hear it, we can experience more than any people before us. Terrible things happen in Uvalde, Texas. And you may have seen and heard video of what happened. Terrible things are happening in Ukraine, and if you turn on the news, you see and you hear what's happening, and we see great suffering, great difficulty, and it is very easy to begin to wonder, where are you, God? Do you even care? Most honest answer is most people find themselves at some point asking the question, God, where are you? I see terrible things. And we see and hear more than anyone before us. And when it comes and impacts us close in, then we ask, God, don't you care? I'm in such pain or suffering. If you've been watching the news, you've been seeing the pictures from the Webb Space Telescope. Have you seen those yet? Amazing, right? Like the farthest out we've ever seen, and it's crazy ridiculous. It's just so beautiful. It's so enormous. And they go, oh yeah, that's like a grain of rice sitting on your finger at arm's length, and there's evidently more around it. And I can't get my head around that at all. I don't know about you. I'm just like, super big. Super big. Super cool, because I'm from California. I can't even get my head around it. And it's very easy when you flip to the next station, it shows them pulling children out of buildings and people starving en masse. It's really, oh my gosh, you just go, God, maybe you just spun the whole universe out there. It seems to be expanding from what we can tell. And it's very big, and maybe God is very distant. Maybe he just made it and went, threw it out like a frisbee, and then went on doing God stuff. And we can ask God, do you even care? Well, here's the deal. There's a theme in the New Testament that you may never have studied before. It's based around a single Greek word that you find all through the Gospels 6 times when they talk about how Jesus feels. Do you even care? How do you feel, God? 6 times it uses this really fun Greek word. It's my favorite Greek word of all Greek words because it's fun to say. It actually sounds like some kind of a lung condition, but it'll come up on your screen, splagnizomai. It does sound like you've got a terrible lung condition. Splagnizomai. Now I want you to understand this word because it doesn't just mean compassion, something bigger than that. So if you're uncomfortable with talking to strangers, try to talk to somebody you know. And if there's nobody here you know, talk to somebody who's not there at all. And, it's California, nobody will even notice. So I want you to say this Greek word with me to kind of lock it in. The word is splagnizomai. Turn to somebody that you trust enough to say a Greek word in front of it and say splagnizomai. Will you do it? The first service did great, by the way. I think this first service did better. Are they out of coffee? So say it with me again. Splagnizomai. Oh, no, now you guys are getting better. Okay, splagnizomai. This word is translated, primarily it's translated compassion. Compassion. Now, the word is actually cooler than that. It actually has a lot more punch than just compassion. Have you ever experienced something that was so deep emotionally that you felt it in your stomach? That you kind of felt like almost an upset stomach, or just like your stomach clenched when you saw it or experienced it? You're like, oh. You might even have made a sound and said something you weren't planning. Like, Lord, oh. That's splagnizomai. If you define the word, it means this: to feel it in your guts. It's the emotion of mercy and compassion, but that you feel in your guts. And I've experienced it many times over the course of my life. And with my work now with Global Training Network, I work with people sometimes who are deeply impoverished. I think like being in Ethiopia and we're trying to get to the airport, and literally our car is surrounded by children who are starving, and they're banging on the window and asking for food, and women are holding their babies up. They're starving babies, and people who are amputees begging for money, driving through little towns all through Rwanda, and just seeing abject poverty. If it doesn't grow in your garden, you got nothing to eat. And seeing, global challenges regularly causes me to think, how do I respond? And what does this mean about God? How does he feel? Because he sees it all. He knows it all. Splagnizomai is the idea of feeling it in your gut. In the early 90s, we were in Russia. We were in a fifth floor walk-up in Moscow. I remember walking up the stairs because you don't take those elevators. They're really sketchy. People, if you go in and you're my size, people go, no. They come out of their apartments. And they pull you out. They're like, don't go in there, man. Why? And I remember walking up. It was dark. There was always pornography posted all over the walls, really kind of vile pornography, and smells of urine and heat and hopelessness. We knocked on a door, and a young woman comes out. She's like 19 years old. She's got a black eye and a baby. I look inside her apartment. I realize it's not an apartment, it's a compartment. It's probably the size of my wife's walk-in closet. I say my wife because none of my clothes get to go in there. But it was really small. And we were with a church planter who was starting a new church, and we introduced her to him and said, we're from America, just talking to people about Jesus. He's the hope of the world. And this man's here to gather a community of hope. But I remember looking at her and her black eye and smelling the filth of her apartment and looking at her little baby and sensing hopelessness that you could almost taste. And I felt splagnizomai. I felt nauseous, stomach cramped, had trouble speaking. And I wish I could tell you I know what happened to her. We introduced her to the guy, and I hope she became part of the church, but it felt like hopelessness. And as I've studied this theme, or this Greek word, it's connected to Jesus. As I said 6 times, I recognize, how does Jesus feel when he sees a woman who's just got a beating with her baby, starving to death in an unheated 5th floor commie condo in Moscow with no hope of change? Do you care? As we read these passages today, I think you're going to find that in the first 5 uses of this word, Jesus feels passion in his gut, and he does a miracle to change the situation. He does something different in the 6th one. We'll wrap up with that. So we're going to look at them fairly quickly. You've got notes in front of you. And look at Mark chapter 1, verse 40. It shows an incident where Jesus encounters a man with leprosy. Now, leprosy, as you may know, is kind of an icky disease to get or to be born with. Body parts fall off, you rot, you're pushed away from society. And in Jesus' day, people thought, oh, those guys, bad karma. They wouldn't use that term. But they thought, they did something wrong, God's punishing them, that's why they're like that. That's why they look all funny and they're away from others. In the ancient world, did you know that they had to ring a bell? They had to stay out of the city? Completely marginalized people for their whole life. It's not like you get better. It's not like Monty Python, I feel better now. You still have leprosy. So you ring a bell and you would say in Aramaic, outcast, unclean, so that nobody could get near you, because even to get near you was, they just don't want to be near you. You're obviously a sinner and you're really sick. So here's Jesus. How does Jesus deal with somebody whose life has been wrecked by disease? Now look, we can all say theologically, suffering comes because of sin and the fall, and sickness comes with it. Absolutely. But does God just say, well, too bad, circumstances is sin? How does God feel when you run into something like this? Mark 1:40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees. This guy did not ring his bell and say, outcast, stay back. He just came up to Jesus and he dropped on his knees, and maybe one of his toes fell off. And he says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now look at verse 41. It doesn't only say that Jesus felt compassion, like needs am I, in his gut for the guy. It said he was filled with it. Jesus sees this man who's way too close, probably smells horrible. It's a socially awkward moment. And Jesus just goes, oh my gosh. And his stomach turns, not because the guy has leprosy, because he's a creation of the living God. He deserves value and honor. It says Jesus is filled with emotion, with passion. And then he reaches out his hand, because Jesus is a touchy guy. He's got his hands on everything. His mom is probably going, stop it. Jesus, stop touching it. Stop touching that. Jesus, stop it. You know, what she should have said is, Jesus, touch more stuff. So Jesus puts out his hand and he touches the untouchable guy, and the guy is instantaneously healed. And man, again, remember, if you've got leprosy, it's like half of your nose is gone, 2 of your fingers is gone, 1 foot's gone, and all this stuff, immediately the leprosy left him, the sickness left him, and he was healed. So I don't know if foot's come popping out, fingers keep coming out or whatever, but guess what? This guy's life was changed forever. And we think that God did these things to point out the greatness of Jesus. He's the Messiah. Look, he can heal. He can do all these things. But he didn't have to touch the guy. Why did he do it? He kept touching people. Touchy, icky stuff. And it's cool. He could touch me. And I'm icky stuff. And so are you. None of us are worthy of God's healing and wholeness in our salvation or anything. And yet he says, look, I want to do it in a very personal way. And this guy's life was revolutionized. So we go, wow, it's great. Amazing. The disciples must have been so stoked. He's our guy. He's our rabbi. You should follow Jesus. Look at this. Icky guy is no longer icky. It's awesome. Right? But this tells us something about God, the one who is unchanging. He's the same today as he was then. It tells us about the Father and the Spirit, that Jesus comes to be the exact representation of that which we cannot see. He is the image of the invisible God. God is invisible to us. And we look around the world and we go, oh my gosh, sickness and suffering and famine and politics and war. And do you care? And where are you? Did you just spin us out there into the universe? And are you beyond the ends of the Webb telescope? This tells us Jesus healed him not just to show who he was, not just to touch him to show him value and honor, but Jesus felt his pain. He felt the suffering of this man. It's the same today. It's good news. You go, well, that's great. Jesus felt that guy's pain. But guess what? Jesus keeps feeling it. What is God like? He's like Jesus. Look at Matthew 20. 2 blind men, verse 30. I told the first service, I got up this morning, I'm having a cup of coffee, I'm trying to look through my notes and pray and hear from God, and as I'm reading this, as 2 blind men came by the roadside, and in my mind, I started hearing, 3 blind mice, 3 blind mice, and it won't go away, and now I've passed it on to you, so tag you're it. 2 blind men came. If you're not used to this kind of teaching or whatever this is that I'm doing up here, I'm not really sorry. It's just the way I do everything. And it's even, believe me, it's a lot weirder when you're in a room with Africans who are going. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside. When they heard Jesus was going by, they shouted, what? Lord, Son of David, have what? Mercy. Because they were blind and they were rejected. Nobody figured because of their bad karma or their parents, they wouldn't use karma, but that these guys were blind. God was punishing them. They didn't deserve anything. And they said, mercy. They cried out again, even louder. Mercy. And the crowd's like, shut up, you people. You are cursed by God. Be quiet. This is an important man. And Jesus stopped and called to them, hey, what do you want me to do for you? Which I think is just crazy, right? I'm like, why did Jesus ask them? Like, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus, help us, you know? And they said, we want to see. And I don't know why Jesus did this, but I think he wanted them to ask him, not just for mercy, but for his goodness, for his action. And there's a lesson to us. Stopped them and he says, what do you want me to do? And Lord, they said, we want our sight. And now Jesus had what? In Greek, he had splagnizomai. Everybody's going, I don't know if I remember it. I don't want to say it out loud. It's the guilt and shame cycle. I go to church and I get guilt and shame. And so he's looking at these guys. They're blind. Was Jesus involved in their creation? Absolutely. Did God know they would be blind? Yes, absolutely. And yet when he sees their situation, it says he goes, oh man. And all these people around him shouting, going, come on, let's go on to do something great. Come and teach. You're the super pastor. Come and preach. And he just stops. And he doesn't just prove who he is by his action. He gets a tummy ache. He goes, ah. You say, well, why doesn't God just erase all the pain and suffering in the world? There's theologians and philosophers who want to talk into all that stuff. But for whatever reason, at least yet at that moment, for everybody, it's not what he was doing. What he did say was, he goes, I feel it. I am with you. I care. Jesus had compassion on them. And then he goes over, and because Jesus is Captain Handsy, he touches their eyes. You don't touch 6 people. Now he's ritually unclean. He doesn't care. How does Jesus show compassion? Comes in person. It's person to person. Hand to eyes. And immediately they received their sight and started following him. Oh, Jesus, when people are sick and they're running into all the problems of our world, Jesus, he feels it. He doesn't just say, consequences, see? He doesn't just say, well, it'll be better in heaven. He enters into it. The third incident is with a dead child, which is really sensitive. And I know that some of you, like me, have experienced where you had a child that didn't live to our age. You didn't get old and bald and gray. And so I really want you to understand, I'm not being trite. I'm saying that Jesus reveals how God feels. How does God feel when a child or a baby does not get to live out what we would consider be a normal lifespan? Luke 7, Jesus is approaching the town gate. It's a town called Nain, small town. A dead person was being carried out, the only son of a mother who was a widow. In the ancient world, if your husband died, you have real problems. If you have a son, you have the hope of somebody caring for you when you get older. Now her son is dead, and she's a woman who's devalued in the ancient world, and may starve to death. And people might say, oh, see, kind of bad karma. You did something wrong. God has taken your children. It's a very uncompassionate kind of world. And Jesus steps into the situation, dead body being carried out. Verse 13, when the Lord saw her, he sees her in her pain, his heart went out to her. It's one Greek word. Guess what the word is? Splagnizomai. His heart went out to her. Literally, his emotions were overwhelming when he thought of her pain and suffering. How does Jesus feel when someone loses a child? Do you even care? We see repetitively, how does God respond emotionally to these things of suffering? These things in the long life of Jesus, 3-year ministry, we only have little scraps what we know about him. They included specific things for specific reasons. And Paul tells us, and the writer of Hebrews tells us, that this is to help us see God when we can't see him. It's exact representation. Last month, a friend of mine had a baby that they were really waiting for, and it came very, very early. And 19 days later, I got a text that said, this child is now with Christ. And I could just I felt sick to my stomach when I read it. I'd been praying every day going, God, fix it, please, fix it, please, fix it, please, fix it. And I thought, I wonder if they're thinking, God, do you even care? I mean, how do you feel about this, Jesus? Why did Luke include this particular incident? It was to show us how God feels, that He is with us, and not just with us invisibly, but that He cares. He feels. He says, don't cry. You ever done that at a funeral? Don't cry? Don't do that. When you're at a funeral, don't tell people not to cry. Let them cry. Right? I have said this at a funeral before. Please don't cry. I was a younger guy and I didn't have the Jesus thing down very well. I said, don't cry to people because they're suffering. I didn't want to enter into it. It's too much. Have you ever avoided a funeral because I just can't do it. I can't take it. I can't get into it. What would Jesus do? Jesus intentionally entered in, and He allowed even his emotions to come into play, because it says his heart went out to her. I think He said, don't cry, because it was too painful to watch. It wasn't wrong for her because Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible, Luke 11:35, right? If you want to memorize a short one, Jesus wept. She did nothing wrong by weeping. It was not a sign of weakness or lack of faith. What it was her overwhelm. And Jesus said, don't cry. And I don't know why, but I'll bet you it was like, when I say that, it's like, oh man, it's so hard to be here. He went up and He touched the coffin. Here he goes again. He goes up, he's actually on like a plank, and he goes up and he touches it, making himself ritually unclean, and everybody in the crowd did this. They all went, because you don't touch dead stuff. And Jesus did. The people carrying it stood still. Everybody was in shock. And then Jesus says something. He says, young man, get up. And the guy got up. And the place turned into a party. It went from a funeral to a celebration. I mean, his mother was probably just, in unbelief. His disciples were going, Rabbi Jesus, He's the best. Everybody was just, oh my gosh, what power does this guy have? But the thing we can miss in here is that Jesus' heart went out to this woman, and He told her, don't cry. And He wasn't just saying, don't cry because I know what I'm going to do. Right? I think people said that. Like, well, Jesus knew He was going to raise him, and He's like, it's dumb for you to cry because you're going to be really happy now. But guess what? He wept at Lazarus' funeral, and He knew exactly what He was going to do for Lazarus, and he was the one crying. Why? Because brokenness and sickness and death and war and famine, suffering, they aren't lost on God. He is not aloof. He is not distant. He engages His creation as a good daddy. And even though Jesus was fixing it, He entered into the suffering of splagnetzomai. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb. Why? Because death, even when we know that resurrection is right around the corner, it's an enemy, and it's sick, and it's sad, and brings suffering to people that we love around us. And where is God? Jesus tells me. For me, I feel so blessed that I have a God who loves me enough to say, I will suffer with you. I'm always going to be right next to you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. But when I'm there, you need to know that I care. And it hurts me too. I mean, God, theologically it's a weird thing to say, but God tied up Himself with our situation in a way that allows Him to feel pain. I think it's the most concise way I can say it theologically. Because He becomes our daddy and He loves us. Where is God? Even in the times where a young one does not get to live a full life. He is with us. He suffers with us. The next one's in Matthew 14, verse 14. Feeding of the 5,000. It's in each of the four Gospels. Why did they include this particular passage? It shows Jesus' power over nature. Verse 14 of Matthew 14, it says, when Jesus landed and He saw the large crowd, He had splagnetzomai. He saw these people and they were hungry. And they had no leadership. And they were under a harsh religion. And he felt, man. The fifth one, Matthew 15, one verse later, another mass feeding. People were hungry in the ancient world as they are in the majority world. Matthew 15, verse 32, Jesus called his disciples to him. First he goes, hey guys, come here. He tells them, man, I have compassion on these people. When we rolled up here and we saw these people and they're really hungry, he goes, makes me sad. They've already been here 3 days and they have nothing to eat. These people were starving, and the sound in the area was the sound of grumbling stomachs. He goes, I don't want to send them away hungry. They might collapse. And what's interesting is Jesus' compassion moves him to move them. And I want you to understand this. As we think about what does it mean to be an agent of the compassion of God, it is that he does things and he equips us and invites us to be part of it with him. I see this as being about production and distribution. Right? Take a look at Mark 6:41. We're here at the feeding of the 5,000 hungry people. Taking the loaves and the 2 fish, he looks up to heaven. He gives thanks, God, for not a lot. He breaks the loaves, and then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. So, Jesus' job is production. He's like breaking bread, making bread, breaking bread, breaking bread. He's just boom, 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 boom. And they're looking at it going, whoa, this is crazy. How is he doing that? I don't know. He just said, like, hand it out. So there's a huge crowd of people, and he is in charge of production. They're in charge of distribution. Why? Because of his compassion on the hungry horde. Jesus has a heart for those who are in need in the world. Now, if we're his disciples, if he is in charge of production and provides enough, we are in charge of distribution. That seems really simple. He doesn't change yesterday, today, forever. Jesus hasn't changed. And so I would believe that his disciples are also invited into his compassion-driven work of feeding people when they don't even have basic food, maybe water. Did you know there's 828 million people that will go hungry in the world today? That's a huge number. 828 million. It's a staggering number. It makes you go, what can we do about that? I don't know what we could do about that. I believe we're going to see we're already seeing a great humanitarian crisis in our world with people all over places that I've even got to be where, man, like South Sudan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, places where people already live on almost nothing. If the garden goes bare, big problems, there's nothing to eat. And with what's going on in the world right now, including the war in Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, I believe a gigantic famine is coming, in particular for India and really for Africa. We should already be thinking as followers of Jesus, how will we respond to the next level, whatever 828 million, whatever the next level is. That's 1 in 10 people in the world. So what does Jesus do? He produces enough food, he gives it to his disciples, and he goes, be generous and distribute it. They did. How stoked were those guys doing this, by the way? Can you imagine how exciting it was for them to just go, man, I don't know what he's doing, but he's just making bread after bread, and look at all these people being fed. Can you imagine how thankful these people were? How great it was to join God in that work? And I believe that God still is calling us, his disciples, into a ministry, compassionate distribution of his production. And most of us have enough to help. We have enough to help. I love it in John chapter 6. Philip looks at him and he goes, man, where are we going to get enough money for all this? That can't even, 8 months' wages wouldn't even buy enough for everybody to have a bite. And he's like us. When I see 828 million, I just go, man, I don't know what you do with that. This week I got notes from a friend in Southeast Asia. Can't mention the country because it'd be dangerous. A friend in Southeast Asia saying, please pray because inflation here is making it harder and harder to buy rice for our orphans. and the people in general. A little later in the week, I got a note from a friend who's a bishop in Uganda, and he said, please be praying. Inflation is getting worse, and we're having more and more trouble feeding people here. It's really, really bad. Well, how does God feel about that? Jesus tells us. He felt it in his gut. So what did he do? He produced enough, more than enough. And then he asked his disciples to be distributors. I think that we can join in that too. And if you're like Philip and you think, man, how can I make any difference? I don't know where to start, right? Maybe you've heard pastors tell the story all the time. The story about the starfish. Have you heard the story of the starfish? There's been a high tide. The beach is full of starfish. They're dying in the sun. Little boy is picking up starfish, throwing one into the water. There's piles of them as far as you can see. Picks up another, throws it into the water. Man comes by and says, you can't possibly do anything for all these starfish. You're wasting your time. And he goes, making a difference for this one. It's making a difference for this one. And Jesus did not call me or you to end world hunger individually. Maybe he did you. He didn't me, because I don't have any wisdom for this. What I don't know is not this one, not this one. I would encourage you, like Jesus says to his disciples, they said, we got to send them away. There's no food. And he goes, you give them something to eat. And then he provided enough. The sixth incident is a little bit like this. It's in Matthew 9. Jesus lands and he sees the crowds, verse 36. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. He saw a crowd again and he went, oh my gosh, oh myself. He called his 12 disciples to him and he gave them authority to drive out demons, heal every disease and sickness. You know what happens in the next chapter? The 12 go out. Then later the 72 go out. See, God had felt compassion. And how did he answer the needs of the multitudes? He sent his disciples. We're his disciples. We are sent too as agents of compassion. So as we wrap up, I want you to think about 3 ways that you might apply what we've been talking about today. Before that, I'll tell you one thing that I think it's a great application is we should be thrilled that we are loved by a daddy who feels our pain and is not distant. He doesn't leave the house when you cry. When he knows that you're concerned about your job, when he knows that you're concerned about a family member who's running into memory problems, and he knows that you even probably are wondering where he's at, he says, I'm not just here with you, but I love you, and I feel it with you. And he can do something about it. Man, I'm so thankful to be loved by Jesus. Aren't you? Man, he loves you. He'll never back away. In your ugliness, he'll never back away. Here's the first thing I would do if I was going to try to apply this. First is I would say, I need to know his compassion personally. I need to know it. Take these notes home. Look at all the passages. Look all the way through them. And what you see is Jesus feeling it in his gut, feeling it in his gut in every situation. And in every situation for you, you need to know he loves me. He has all the power, all the knowledge in the world. He loves me more than anything. He knows what's best and right. And when I suffer, he doesn't always remove me from it, but he's always with me in it, and he feels it. It costs him something, as the cross did. Know his compassion. And you may feel like, I don't really deserve God's compassion because, I'm the master of my own chaos and I run off into sin like the prodigal son. Luke 15. It's a great reflection tonight. Read Luke 15, and what you find here is 15:20. Can we show that? The kid he'd been a wild man. He'd been off in Vegas, party. There were no hookers left untouched. He's lost all his money. Comes home. He's barefoot. He's beaten. He's emaciated, and he is shamed that he has blown it all. And he comes home to his father, and when he's still a far way long off, the father was filled with splanchnizomai. So when you find yourself in the pit and you think, well, this is a consequence to my action, God's just going, see, there you go. That's what my dad would say, right? There you go. You're an idiot. You get an idiot's reward. That's not the way God is. Evidently the Father's looking. Do you ever get that? He's a long way off, and the Father sees him. How? He doesn't have a telescope. He's out there looking for him. And when he sees him, he doesn't go, see, this is what, he never says, see, I told you so. And he doesn't say it to you either. What he says is, come in and let's celebrate. You're back. I feel so sad that this happened to you. I love you. Maybe this morning, that's what you need to hear more than anybody else in the room is God feels compassion on you when you keep crashing in the same car or the same sin. And you go put out the fire with gasoline. Those are David Bowie quotes, by the way. He is a God of greater compassion than you and I could ever imagine. We must know it personally, because when we do, we begin to act like his disciples and we extend it to others. So know his compassion. All those things are in your notes. Take them home. Look at them a little more. Show his compassion. If we're his disciple, it's our job to distribute goodness, compassion, food throughout the world. Show it globally first. If you go to my website, chuck.org, there's a blog there linked to this sermon, The Agents of Compassion. And you may be thinking, how could I help with world hunger? Jesus wants me to distribute, but there's so many organizations, so much corruption, so much waste, I don't know where to begin. Well, if you go to the blog, what you'll find there is 3 organizations that are 4-star, which is the highest possible efficiency and effectiveness, and they're watched more than others, that are really good at getting anything you give to people that go hungry. So don't get stymied by 800 bajillion, quadrillion people. Just go and go, man, I can go on one of these sites and I can say, but not this one, and not that one either. So become a person who shows compassion globally. Finally, show compassion locally. The people that are around you in your life are there on purpose, and you think, wow, I got ripped off with my family, Maybe you're thinking, my family are knuckleheads. Oh no, God, why did you give them to me? Or your workmates or your friends. They're there on purpose. And some of those people need you, instead of telling them, bad job, stop doing it, giving them guilt, telling them, well, I love you, but, and here's all the other things, is, man, you could come alongside and say, how can I simply enter into their suffering with them? Love them, listen, bless them, pray for them, whether they deserve it or not. To be Christ's people, we need to know his compassion. We need to enter into it through giving and sharing and showing locally, and I believe globally. I think he's produced enough food. I think that we just need to be better at distributing it for him. You are loved by a God who knows everything about you, even the secret things. And he is crazy about you. Me too. And I know me. And he says, I love you, Chuck. And when you're an idiot and you're dumb, or you get just consequences, look, I love you. When life throws you a curveball you didn't see coming, I saw it coming. And I feel it with you. I'm not immune, just saying, get over it, it'll be better in heaven. I love you. Do you know how incredibly loved you are? When you know that and you show it to others, that changes the world for Jesus. That's when we're acting out his disciples, going from believing to being. That's what Jesus did. He came in an age of belief, and he was being what God is, and that includes a compassionate, merciful, loving, sweet, for you, Jesus. Let's pray. Jesus, Lord, thank you for showing us the Father. Thank you for showing us you and the Spirit. That you're not merely a God who's got a big plan and we're kind of like little pawns in your plan, but we're kids who are loved by you and you enter in with us. Incredible. Father, thank you for sending the Son. Thank you for showing us repeatedly how you feel and what you're like. Lord, let us learn to understand that in a greater way and to live that out in a greater way tomorrow than we did today for your glory. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.